Officers from the Eagan, Minnesota Police Department and the Dakota County Jail left a 50-year-old postal worker suffering from a stroke on the floor for almost 6 hours, and then he died. According to a lawsuit filed by family members of Kingsley Bimpong, for over 5 hours and 40 minutes, he displayed clear signs of a stroke. Yet he was booked into the Dakota County Jail and left on the floor untreated. And as bad as you might think that this story is, it only gets worse when you hear the insane statement put out by the city of Eagan's lawyer. Hey, speaking of lawyers, I'm America's attorney. I've been a lawyer for over 24 years. I've helped over 2 million people. Let's break down this federal lawsuit, what happened in the 5 hours leading up to Kingsley's death, and the absolute trash reaction on behalf of the city. This lady, she is why people hate lawyers. Kingsley Bimpong was a 50-year-old lawful permanent resident originally from Ghana who built a life in the Twin Cities as a husband and a father to a minor child and a dedicated employee of the USPS since 2016. His life wasn't marked by crime or substance use. The lawsuit notes no prior arrests, no evidence of alcohol or drugs at the time of the stop. According to the lawsuit, on the evening of November 16, 2024, he left his shift early after complaining of a sudden headache and vision problems. After leaving work, Kingsley drifted into oncoming traffic and onto a median, prompting a stop by the Eagan Police Department. So far, so good. Body camera footage and the lawsuit state that Bimpong was visibly confused and disoriented. He had an unstable gait, and he answered, "I don't know," when officers asked routine questions like his own name, where he was going, or where he lived. During the traffic stop, one of the officers, Sergeant Joseph Mosing, called in a specially trained drug recognition evaluator, but the evaluation was never properly conducted. No vital signs were taken. The full 12-step intoxication check was never completed, even though Bimpong did not smell of alcohol and there was no evidence of drugs in his car. Instead of immediately transporting Bimpong to a hospital, officers arrested him and brought him first to the Eagan Police Department for a blood draw warrant and then to the Dakota County Jail, all while his symptoms worsened. According to the lawsuit, when Kingsley arrived at the EPD, he stumbled as he exited the squad car, appeared confused, and was unable to follow simple instructions, still handcuffed and visibly weak on his right side. Instead of calling for emergency medical assistance, officers Joseph Mosing and Martin Jensen placed him on a bench while they worked to obtain a search warrant for a blood draw. Over the next hour, Bimpong displayed telltale signs of a stroke, including nodding off, slumping forward, and one-sided weakness and speech difficulties. I don't even know why I'm calling these telltale signs. They're just the signs of a stroke. Jensen later speculated that it might be a dissociative of some sort, thinking like ketamine, a diagnosis that still required hospital care, but that was never pursued. Body camera recordings reveal that during these conversations, the officers muted their microphones multiple times, directly violating department policy requiring continuous recording during arrests and detentions. In one instance, Mosing was reportedly heard beginning to say, "Is this dude having a stroke? Uh-oh," before cutting the audio feed. He said stroke. Now, despite this clear awareness that Bimpong's condition was critical, they pressed forward with paperwork instead of just calling EMS, delaying medical care for more than 2 hours. Then around 12:45 a.m., after more than 2 hours of visible medical decline inside the police department, Kingsley was transported to the Dakota County Jail in Hastings. According to the federal complaint, officers reported to jail staff that he had no medical issues, despite his obvious imbalance and incoherence on body cam footage, aka medical issues. Eagan officer Martin Jensen was met by correctional officers Eduardo DeCache, Ramsey Strickland, Christopher Severson, and Lucio Manuel Marquez Zazuda, all defendants in the lawsuit. Surveillance video described in the lawsuit shows Bimpong barely able to stand, relying on the wall and the officers for balance as they conducted a pat-down and guided him through pre-booking. The lawsuit basically describes 2024 Joe Biden. Within minutes, staff marked him as not requiring further evaluation, and a medical questionnaire was signed just 6 minutes after intake, noting it could not be completed. In fact, that alone should have triggered an emergency call, meaning that guy couldn't complete his own medical questionnaire. Now, instead of sending him to the hospital, officers kept their own heads way up their butts and moved him toward the body scanner, where he continued to stumble and needed to be physically supported. Sorry, that still sounds like we're talking about 2024 Biden. The complaint emphasized that everyone involved, from the arresting officers to the jail intake team, witnessed a man in an obvious medical crisis, but failed to act. Once Kingsley was locked inside cell I-321 at the Dakota County Jail, he spent more than 3 hours in visible, untreated medical crisis. Surveillance footage described in the lawsuit shows him collapsing repeatedly, lying half naked in urine and trying to pull himself up before falling again. Guards conducted so-called well-being checks, but instead of intervening, they simply scanned their badges and marked inmate okay, which I guess means that the standards are really low there. It wasn't until roughly 4:30 a.m. that Officer Brittany Corbin noticed that he was foaming at the mouth and having seizure-like movements. And when she told Dakota, he allegedly replied that Bimpong had been like that all night and was fine. She left without calling a nurse. And only minutes later did Dakota and nurse Jessica Holman finally enter the cell, by which time Bimpong was cold to the touch, his pupils fixed, and his tongue gray and protruding. His blood pressure was measured at an astonishing 240/216, a hypertensive crisis. You guys know I'm not a nurse or a doctor, but like 130/80 would be like a lot better. Narcan was administered 3 times with no effect, confirming that the problem was not drugs, but a medical emergency, to which I say, duh. Even then, some guards continued logging well-being okay as he lay unresponsive. Wow. I don't think they know what well-being okay means. An ambulance wasn't called until 4:56 a.m., nearly 3.5 hours after his booking. By the time the paramedics arrived, Bimpong had been unconscious for hours, his brain starved of oxygen. He was transported to Regina Hospital and later declared brain dead, much like the officers who arrested him, a timeline the lawsuit calls the epitome of deliberate indifference. The wrongful death lawsuit filed in October of 2025 lays out a sweeping civil rights case under 42 U.S.C. 1983, accusing both the EPD and Dakota County of deliberate indifference to Bimpong's obvious medical crisis. Filed in the U.S. District Court for the District of Minnesota, the complaint names 11 individual defendants, including Sergeant Joseph Mosing, Officers Liam O'Shea and Martin Jensen, and multiple jail staff, along with Dakota County itself. Think about that. 11 different people who could have said, hey, we have to call a doctor, but no one did it. The lawsuit alleges that every minute of delay after the first signs of stroke violated Bimpong's constitutional rights under the 8th and 14th Amendments, which guaranteed detainees basic medical care and protection from cruel or inhumane treatment. The suit argues that the county's systemic failures went far beyond one night's negligence. According to the complaint, the jail's training record showed expired CPR certifications and staff regularly falsified well-being checks to satisfy internal logging systems instead of conducting real observations. It also contends that Dakota County destroyed portions of surveillance video, violating state preservation rules and obscuring how long Bimpong truly suffered unattended. And there are rules in court about destruction of evidence, which are going to come back to haunt the county. While the federal lawsuit focuses on civil liability, criminal charges remain a remote but possible outcome depending on the findings of state and federal investigations. Under Minnesota law, prosecutors could consider charges such as criminal negligence resulting in death or misconduct of a public officer if evidence shows jail or police personnel willfully ignored an obvious medical emergency. However, such prosecutions are rare. Cases involving in-custody deaths typically hinge on proving intent or recklessness beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a high bar when officers claim they believe the person was intoxicated rather than in medical crisis. It's more likely that accountability will play out through the civil courts rather than criminal indictments. Now, public reaction to the death of Kingsley Bimpong and the lawsuit filed against Eagan Police Department and Dakota County Jail has been swift and sharp. Civil rights attorneys from Robbins Kaplan LLP described the case as a shocking example of how a clear medical emergency was treated as a criminal issue, arguing that every minute of delay in recognizing his stroke amounted to deliberate indifference. The filing has reignited public debate around the role of policing when medical distress is involved, including why officers appear to assume intoxication rather than illness, and why body cameras were muted just as the word "stroke" might have been uttered. Legislators in Minnesota are responding too. There's efforts resurfacing to tighten body camera policies so that audio cannot be muted without clear justification, a reform that advocates say could help prevent similar tragedies. Meanwhile, both the city of Eagan and Dakota County have issued very limited public statements, each citing the active litigation and declining to accept responsibility. I have a proposal for these legislators. Why don't you just make it a criminal misdemeanor for officers to turn off their audio or visual recordings? It's super straightforward. But in an effort to make the list of the vilest living Americans, Eagan's attorney Vicky Ruby gave a disgusting, revolting quote that is just lies. Here is her dishonest version of what happened. Hours after Egan officers transported Mr. Bimpong to jail, it was discovered he had experienced a stroke, which was fatal. That's what she said. While Mr. Bimpong's death is tragic, he was not exhibiting an objectively serious medical condition that was obvious to laypersons at the time he was in the Egan officer's custody, and there was no indication that he required emergent medical treatment. You know, I don't hate lawyers. I am a lawyer, and I think that lawyers are vital to life in a free country. And so for an attorney like Ruby to compromise her own ethics, indeed, her own humanity, is just completely revolting to me. I'm disgusted that she and I share the same licensure. It's gross. The cops are almost guilty of murder. I mean, they certainly have blood on their hands, but maybe it was just gross negligence. But this lawyer, this is a studied quote. She thought and thought about what lies she could tell to cover up the malfeasance of the cops. There's a part of me that thinks that maybe, just maybe, she's even worse than they are. Kingsley's story shows us that systemic indifference can be just as deadly as violence itself. If a 50-year-old postal worker suffering from a stroke can be mistaken for a drunk or a drugged driver, then how many others of us are at risk? If you believe accountability matters and that no one should die begging for help in a jail cell, share this story with others and leave your thoughts down below in the comments. What does justice look like, according to you, in this case? Should charges be pressed against the negligent officers? Drop your pro se opinion down below in the comments. And if you want more America's Attorney breakdown stories just like this one to show up in your feed down the road, make sure that you lawyer up with me by hitting that subscribe button. As you know, we are so close to hitting 50,000 subscribers. I'd love for you to join us, and I will see you next time.